Eleanor Vaughn never expected that losing her wallet in a tiny seaside town would flip her world upside down. Instead of a quick escape back to her empire, she found herself working in a diner, making pancakes, and questioning everything she once believed. But just when she thought she had found a new purpose, a devastating ultimatum forced her to choose: her billion-dollar company or the life she never knew she wanted. Who really has her back? Is love worth risking everything? And when the past comes knocking, will she fight for her second chance or walk away forever? Stay until the end, because the biggest twist is yet to come. Love stories of unexpected romance and tough choices? Hit subscribe now so you never miss another thrilling tale. If you had to choose between love and success, what would you pick? Drop your answer in the comments. Cassian Vance pushed open the door to the small back office of Rustwood Diner, expecting nothing more than another quiet morning. Instead, he stopped dead in his tracks. A woman was sprawled across the worn-out couch, her long legs awkwardly bent, one arm draped over her face as she slept. Her dark blazer was half slipped off her shoulder, and strands of chestnut hair had come loose from a once perfect bun. Cassian's first instinct was to assume the worst. Someone had broken in, but the door had been locked when he arrived. His jaw tightened as he stepped closer. "Hey!" His voice was low but firm. The woman didn't stir. Cassian sighed and folded his arms. "All right, Sleeping Beauty, time to wake up." Still nothing. He leaned down slightly, this time clapping his hands together. "Hey, lady, you're in my office." With a sharp inhale, the woman jolted upright, eyes wide with panic. She blinked rapidly, disoriented, before her gaze landed on Cassian. Her body tensed, and for a second she looked ready to bolt. "Shit!" Cassian arched an eyebrow. "Yeah, I was thinking the same thing." The woman swung her legs off the couch, immediately reaching for her blazer, trying to smooth down her wrinkled blouse. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pushed back her hair. I didn't mean to be here," she stammered. "Then why are you?" His voice was steady, but there was an edge of curiosity. She opened her mouth, then hesitated, glancing at the desk like an answer might be hidden there. Finally, she exhaled. "I must have fallen asleep." Cassian leaned against the doorframe. "In my office?" She swallowed, clearly embarrassed. "Look, I can explain." His gaze flicked over her once more. High heels covered in dust, a faint smudge of mascara under her eyes, the tight lines of exhaustion on her face. He had seen people like her before, running from something. "I'm listening," he said. Her throat bobbed as she looked down at her hands. "I think I just lost everything. I shut 12 hours earlier." The chime of the diner's front doorbell echoed through the space, and Cassian barely glanced up from behind the counter. He was used to the usual crowd, truckers, locals, the occasional traveler passing through town. But when he did look, he noticed her immediately. She walked in with careful, deliberate steps, her heels clicking softly against the worn checkered floor. There was something regal about the way she carried herself, shoulders squared, head held high. But as she slid into a booth near the window, he caught the subtle shake of her hands when she placed her purse on the seat beside her. The waitress, Carla, approached with a notepad. "Just coffee," the woman murmured. Cassian watched as Carla poured the steaming liquid into a ceramic cup. The woman wrapped both hands around it as if trying to absorb its warmth. Her shoulders lifted slightly as she took a slow breath. But the moment of peace didn't last long. She reached into her pocket, her fingers patting lightly at the fabric. Then her expression shifted. Her brows knitted together as she searched the other pocket. Then her purse. She flipped through the compartments once. Then again, her movements growing more frantic with each second. Cassian set down the dish towel he had been holding. The woman's breath hitched as she checked her coat pockets a final time, then slowly sat back. Her shoulders tensed, her hands resting in her lap as she whispered, almost to herself, I can't find my wallet." The quiet murmur was almost drowned out by the hum of the diner, but Cassian heard it. She looked up, scanning the room as if expecting judgment. No one had noticed, except for him. Her lips parted slightly before pressing together, as if she were debating what to say next. Finally, she exhaled sharply. "I must have left it somewhere. I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." Cassian studied her for a long moment. She was embarrassed, clearly out of her depth. But there was something else. This wasn't just about a missing wallet. He could have let it go. He could have said it wasn't his problem. Instead, he wiped his hands on his apron and leaned forward slightly. "Don't worry about it," he said, his tone casual. "Breakfast is on me." Her head snapped up. "What?" Cassian smirked. "It's just coffee. No big deal." She stared at him, as if trying to decipher some hidden motive. But when she found none, her shoulders sagged slightly. For the first time since she walked in, she allowed herself a breath of relief. "Thank you." Cassian simply nodded and turned back toward the kitchen. But as he moved, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time he'd see her. Lyrian sat quietly at the corner booth, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The warmth had long since faded, but she still held on to it as if it provided some kind of comfort. Her eyes flicked to her phone, which lay motionless on the table. The screen was black, the battery completely drained. She sighed. Just another thing to add to the growing list of problems she had no immediate solution for. Across the diner, Cassian wiped down the counter, stealing glances in her direction. She was different from the usual customers, too polished, too poised, and yet unmistakably out of her element. When she had first walked in, she carried herself like someone who was used to being in control. Now she looked lost. After a few moments, he tossed the rag over his shoulder and approached her table. "You need a charger?" he asked, nodding toward her phone. Lyrian blinked, as if she had momentarily forgotten he was there. "Oh, no, it's fine." Cassian leaned a hip against the table. "You sure? Battery's dead. Wallet's missing. You look like you could use a little luck right now." She let out a dry chuckle, rubbing her temple. "If you happen to have any luck lying around, I'll take it." Cassian smirked. "I might be fresh out." He hesitated before adding, "You need a ride somewhere?" Lyrian hesitated. She knew better than to accept help from strangers, but at the moment, she didn't have much of a choice. She had no money, no phone, and no immediate way to get where she needed to be. "I have a meeting," she admitted. "A really important one, and I'm stuck here." Cassian crossed his arms. "Bank's about 3 miles out. I can take you after my shift." She looked at him, searching his face for anything that might suggest he expected something in return. But there was nothing, just quiet, steady patience. "You don't have to," she said finally. "I know." For some reason that made her exhale, the tension in her shoulders loosening just slightly. "All right," she agreed. "Thank you." Cassian nodded, pushing himself off the table. "I'll be another hour or so. You can wait here if you want." Lyrian nodded, wrapping her hands around the now lukewarm cup of coffee. She wasn't sure why she felt relieved. Maybe it was because, for the first time in a long while, someone wasn't treating her like a business deal or a liability, just a person who needed a hand. As she waited, she found herself watching the life inside the diner. It was different from the corporate world she was used to. The conversations were light, easy. The regulars greeted each other by name. The servers laughed with the customers, and the air smelled of fresh bread and sizzling bacon. It was nothing like the cold, polished boardrooms she spent most of her time in. A small giggle drew her attention. A little girl, no older than 7, had wandered over to her booth, eyes wide with curiosity. She had dark curls that bounced when she moved, and a missing front tooth that made her smile even brighter. "Are you famous?" the girl asked, tilting her head. Lyrian blinked before letting out a small laugh. "Why do you think that?" The girl shrugged. "You talk like people in movies." Lyrian smiled, shaking her head. "I'm not famous." The girl seemed to consider this for a moment. "Then what do you do?" Lyrian hesitated. The answer was simple. She was the CEO of one of the most powerful hotel chains in the country. But saying that here, in this small-town diner, felt off. Before she could answer, Cassian appeared behind the girl, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Thea, don't bother the customers," he said, though his tone was gentle. The girl, Thea, grinned up at him. "I wasn't bothering, I was just asking questions." Cassian gave her a look, but Lyrian smiled. "She's all right," she assured him. Thea beamed and turned back to her. "So if you're not famous, what are you?" Lyrian met her curious gaze, then exhaled slowly. "Just someone trying to figure things out." Thea nodded, as if that was a perfectly reasonable answer. Me too, Lyrian chuckled. Oh yeah? And what are you trying to figure out? Thea's expression turned serious. How to whistle, Cassian sighed. She's been practicing all morning. Thea puffed up her cheeks and tried, but only a faint wheeze came out. She frowned dramatically. See? Lyrian grinned. That's tough. But I think you'll get it. Thea brightened. You think so? I do. Cassian shook his head with a smirk. All right, kid, let's leave the lady alone. Thea huffed but obeyed, skipping off toward the counter. Cassian turned back to Lyrian. She likes new people, he explained. She's adorable, Lyrian said honestly. Cassian's smirk softened. Yeah, she's a handful, but she's a good kid. Lyrian nodded. You're lucky. Cassian considered that for a moment. Yeah, I am. A silence settled between them, comfortable but charged. Then he cleared his throat. I've got to finish up. You still good to wait? Lyrian nodded. Yeah, I'm fine. Cassian studied her for a second longer before heading back toward the kitchen. Lyrian watched him go, then turned back toward the window, her reflection staring back at her. If only she had been so lucky. She had spent her whole life building an empire, creating something that would outlast her. But what had it cost her? She had a boardroom full of executives who respected her, but no one to call when she lost her wallet. She had power, prestige, wealth, and yet at that moment, she had never felt more alone. She exhaled and reached for her coffee, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in her chest. Maybe she had lost more than just her wallet. Maybe without even realizing it, she had lost herself. Cassian's truck rumbled along the narrow road leading out of town, the silence inside the cabin stretching uncomfortably long. Lyrian sat in the passenger seat, her arms crossed over her chest, her mind racing with everything that had happened in the past 24 hours. She had lost her wallet, her phone was dead, and now she was entirely at the mercy of a stranger, one who had, for reasons she still didn't quite understand, decided to help her. The drive to the bank felt longer than 3 miles, mostly because neither of them spoke. Cassian seemed comfortable with the quiet, his fingers tapping idly against the steering wheel, while Lyrian fought the urge to pull out her non-existent phone and pretend to be busy. The bank was a small, unimpressive building tucked between a pharmacy and an insurance office. Lyrian exhaled in relief as she stepped inside, the cool air conditioning a stark contrast to the midday heat outside. She approached the nearest teller, smoothing down her blazer in a futile attempt to regain some sense of professionalism. Good morning, she said, forcing a polite smile. I need to withdraw some cash. I lost my wallet and identification, but I have my account details. The teller, a young woman with thick glasses and a name tag that read Megan, frowned slightly before nodding. Of course, Miss Astor, Lyrian replied. Lyrian Astor. Megan's fingers flew across the keyboard as she pulled up the account. She barely got 2 sentences in before her brows furrowed deeper. I'm sorry, Miss Astor, but for security reasons, we can't process a withdrawal without proper identification. You'll need to confirm your identity at the corporate branch in the city. Lyrian's stomach dropped. I don't have time to go to the city. Isn't there another way? I'm afraid not, Megan said apologetically. Withdrawing a significant amount requires in-person verification. Lyrian clenched her jaw. This was not happening. She was Lyrian Astor, CEO of one of the most powerful hospitality chains in the country. She could buy and sell this entire town if she wanted to. Yet here she was, being told she couldn't access her own money. Cassian, who had been standing a few steps behind, finally spoke up. She's got to have some other way to prove her identity. Megan shook her head. I'm really sorry. It's just protocol. Lyrian exhaled sharply, pressing 2 fingers to her temple. She knew getting angry wouldn't help, but frustration burned in her chest. So, what now? Cassian asked, turning to her. She hesitated. She could call someone from her company. Dorian, her CFO, would be able to authorize a transaction. But that would mean admitting that she was stranded in the middle of nowhere, unable to handle her own affairs. The idea made her stomach churn. She forced a tight smile at Megan. Thanks for your time. As they stepped out of the bank, Cassian glanced at her. I take it that didn't go well. She let out a humorless laugh. You could say that. He leaned against the truck, crossing his arms. So what's the plan now? Lyrian hesitated. She could book a hotel if she had any way to pay for it. She could find a way back to the city if she had any idea how long that would take. But for the first time in her life, she had no immediate solution. No assistant to call. No credit card to swipe. Just herself and a stranger who had already done more for her than he needed to. Cassian seemed to sense her hesitation. After a beat, he shrugged. Look, if you need a place to stay, I've got a spare room. It's not much, but it's a bed. Lyrian blinked, taken aback. You're offering me a place to stay? Cassian smirked. Well, unless you'd rather sleep in the truck. She exhaled, debating her options. There weren't many. And despite her instincts telling her to always rely on herself, she couldn't ignore the fact that Cassian had been nothing but decent to her. Finally, she nodded. All right, but just for one night. He grinned. Whatever you say, princess. She shot him a glare, but he was already climbing into the truck. By the time they arrived at his house, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood. Lyrian stepped out onto the gravel driveway, taking in the modest but well-kept house. It was simple, with a wraparound porch and a vegetable garden off to the side. The kind of place that felt lived in, warm. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cinnamon and something savory cooking in the kitchen. A small voice echoed from the hallway, followed by the sound of quick footsteps. Dad, you're home! A tiny figure barreled into Cassian's legs. A little girl, all dark curls and bright eyes, grinning up at him. Cassian scooped her up effortlessly. Hey, kiddo, you behaving? The girl giggled. Maybe. Lyrian felt a strange pang in her chest as she watched them. Cassian had a daughter. That explained a lot. Cassian set the girl down and gestured toward Lyrian. Thea, this is Lyrian. She's staying here tonight. Thea studied Lyrian with open curiosity. Are you my dad's friend? Lyrian hesitated. Cassian cut in smoothly. She's just passing through. Thea nodded solemnly before looking at Lyrian again. Do you like mac and cheese? Lyrian blinked. I guess? Thea beamed. Good, that's what we're having. Lyrian glanced at Cassian, who only shrugged. She takes dinner very seriously. Dinner, as it turned out, was not just mac and cheese. Cassian moved around the kitchen with practiced ease, sautéing vegetables, grilling chicken, and stirring a pot on the stove. Lyrian leaned against the counter, watching in fascination. You're really good at this. Cassian smirked. You sound surprised. I guess I just thought. She gestured vaguely. You own a diner, but you cook like a professional chef. He chuckled. I used to be. Before all this, I worked in high-end restaurants. Thought that was going to be my life. But after my wife passed, I needed something different. Something stable for Thea. Lyrian felt something tighten in her chest. I'm sorry. Cassian shrugged. It was a long time ago. They fell into a comfortable silence, the only sound the soft sizzle from the stove. Lyrian realized then how long it had been since she'd sat in a kitchen like this, since she'd had a home-cooked meal that wasn't catered or rushed between meetings. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest, something dangerously close to belonging. The morning sun spilled through the windows of Rustwood Diner, casting golden streaks across the wooden floors. The scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the air, mixing with the quiet hum of conversation from the handful of early customers. Behind the counter, Cassian worked effortlessly, flipping pancakes on the griddle while stealing occasional glances toward the farthest booth. Lyrian sat there, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly, her thoughts elsewhere. Last night had been unexpected. She had planned to spend one night, regain her footing, and leave quietly. But something about the warmth of Cassian's home, the way Thea had made her laugh, the way Cassian had cooked with such ease, it all unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite explain. She hadn't felt like just another executive, another face in a sea of high-stakes meetings and boardroom decisions. She had simply been Lyrian, someone who didn't have to have all the answers. But that illusion shattered the moment a sleek black car pulled up in front of the diner. The door opened, and Dorian Wells stepped out, his polished dress shoes clicking against the pavement as he adjusted the cuffs of his pristine suit. Even from inside, Lyrian could feel the tension radiating off him. The moment he entered, his sharp eyes scanned the room before locking onto her. "Lyrian!" His voice cut through the diner, drawing more than a few curious glances. He strode toward her, his jaw tight. "Where the hell have you been? You disappeared for a week. The board is in chaos." Lyrian's stomach clenched. She knew this moment was inevitable, but she hadn't expected it to feel so abrupt. Cassian, who had been carrying a fresh plate of food toward a table, slowed to a stop. His gaze flicked between Lyrian and Dorian, his brows knitting together. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Lyrian exhaled, setting down her coffee cup carefully. There was no more avoiding it. She stood, her movements slow, deliberate. "Dorian, lower your voice." Dorian scoffed, running a hand through his neatly styled hair. "Lower my voice? Lyrian, I've spent the past 5 days fielding calls from investors, calming down shareholders, and trying to convince the board that their CEO hasn't completely lost her mind. And you're here? In some diner?" Cassian stiffened. "Excuse me?" Dorian barely spared him a glance. He was too focused on Lyrian. "You have to come back. Now." Cassian's eyes darkened. Slowly, he set down the plate he had been holding. "Lyrian, who is this guy?" Lyrian's throat felt dry. She turned to Cassian, meeting his gaze. The warmth from last night, the quiet understanding they had shared, it was gone now, replaced with something unreadable. She took a deep breath. "Cassian, Dorian let out an impatient huff. "She's Lyrian Astor, CEO of Astor & Company Silence." The entire diner seemed to still. Cassian stared at her, his expression blank at first, then shifting into something colder. Lyrian swallowed hard. "Cassian, I was going to tell you." Cassian let out a short, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "CEO, right. And here I thought you were just some woman who needed a little help." "It's not like that," Lyrian started. "No?" Cassian crossed his arms, his stance suddenly distant. "Because it sure as hell feels like that," Dorian scoffed, looking between them with mild disbelief. "What exactly is going on here? You've been—" His eyes flicked to Cassian, then to the diner itself. "Staying here? With him?" Cassian's jaw ticked. Lyrian exhaled sharply. "I lost my wallet. My phone was dead. I had no way to get back. Cassian helped me." Cassian let out another dry chuckle. "Helped you? Right. And the whole time, you just conveniently forgot to mention you were a billionaire?" Lyrian opened her mouth but hesitated. How could she explain that for the first time in her life, she hadn't wanted to be Lyrian Astor, CEO? That she had simply wanted to exist without the weight of expectation? "I didn't lie to you," she said quietly. Cassian's expression didn't change. "No, you just left out the part where you could buy and sell this whole town." His words stung more than she expected. Dorian stepped in. "This doesn't matter. We need to go. Now. The shareholders are on edge. Langford Hotels is making moves, and if you don't get ahead of it, they'll use your absence as leverage to push you out." Lyrian clenched her fists. Langford Hotels. Of course they would seize this moment to stir the waters. Cassian studied her, waiting for her response. She took a slow breath before nodding to Dorian. "Give me a minute." Dorian looked irritated but took a step back. She turned to Cassian, searching his face for something. Anything. But his walls were already up. "Cassian," he shook his head. "You don't owe me an explanation. You don't owe me anything." She hated how much those words hurt. "I never meant for you to feel—" "To feel what?" His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "Like an idiot. Like I let someone into my home, my life, only to find out she wasn't even real." "I am real." Cassian let out a slow breath, running a hand over his face. "Yeah? Then tell me this, Lyrian. When you leave, are you ever coming back?" She opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. And that silence? That was enough of an answer. Cassian nodded once, stepping back. "That's what I thought." Lyrian felt something crack inside her. Dorian placed a hand on her arm. "We need to go." Lyrian turned back to Cassian, desperate to fix what had just shattered between them. But it was already too late. Without another word, she followed Dorian out the door, the sharp click of her heels against the diner's floor, the only sound she left behind. Cassian didn't watch her leave. He simply turned back to the counter, picking up the plate he had set down earlier. But the food was already cold. The city skyline loomed in the distance, a blur of glass and steel against the pale morning sky. Lyrian sat in the back of the luxury sedan, staring out the tinted windows as the car moved smoothly along the highway. The further she got from Rustwood, the heavier her chest felt, as if she had left something behind that she wasn't supposed to. Dorian sat beside her, flicking through emails on his tablet. The car ride had been mostly silent, aside from his occasional muttered frustrations about the state of the company. He had already given her a full briefing, how the board had nearly descended into chaos during her disappearance, how Langford Hotels was circling like vultures, waiting for any sign of weakness. She was supposed to feel urgency. She was supposed to feel relieved to be back in control. Instead, all she felt was an emptiness that no amount of corporate damage control could fix. "You need to issue a public statement," Dorian said without looking up. "Something to address your absence. We can spin it. Say you were doing a site evaluation. Something strategic." Lyrian didn't respond. Dorian finally glanced at her, narrowing his eyes. "You're not listening." "I'm listening," she murmured, but even she didn't sound convincing. Dorian sighed, setting his tablet aside. "Lyrian, I get it. You needed space. You wanted to disappear for a bit. But you're back now. It's time to focus." She turned her gaze toward him then, her expression unreadable. "Am I?" Dorian frowned. "Are you what?" "Back." Dorian studied her carefully. "You're sitting here, aren't you?" That wasn't what she meant. She let out a slow breath, turning her attention back to the window. The further they drove, the more she realized the city didn't feel the same. Or maybe she didn't. Cassian tried to move on. Days passed, and Rustwood Diner remained the same. Morning coffee rushes, afternoon lulls, the comforting hum of familiar conversations. From the outside, nothing had changed. But to Cassian, everything felt different. Lyrian was gone. He had known she would leave. Of course she would. She was never meant to stay in a place like this. But knowing that didn't make it any easier. He focused on work, keeping his hands busy. He told himself it didn't matter, that he had only known her for a short time, that she had been just another passerby. But Thea didn't let him forget. "Dad," she asked one evening, her small voice hesitant as she pushed her mashed potatoes around her plate. "Do you think she'll come back?" Cassian's stomach twisted. He looked at his daughter, her wide, hopeful eyes watching him with quiet expectation. He should have had an answer, a simple one, but he didn't. Instead, he reached for his drink, taking a slow sip before setting it down. "Eat your dinner, kid," Thea frowned. "You didn't answer." Cassian sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "I don't know, Thea." She thought about that for a moment, then nodded solemnly. "I think she will." Cassian wished he shared her certainty. Lyrian stood in her office, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of Astor & Company's headquarters. The view stretched far across the city, a glittering maze of endless possibilities. It should have felt like home. Her desk was piled with reports. Investors wanted reassurance. The board wanted strategy. There were emails, calls, meetings. Her calendar was flooded with responsibilities waiting for her attention, and yet none of it could pull her back into the life she had once thrived in. She had thought returning would anchor her, remind her of why she had built this empire in the first place. But all it did was make her realize something she wasn't ready to admit. She didn't belong here anymore, not in the way she used to. Her hands rested on the polished mahogany desk as she inhaled deeply. She had spent her entire life climbing to the top, but now she was beginning to wonder if she had been climbing the wrong mountain. Her phone buzzed. Dorian's name flashed across the screen. She let it ring. Then, without thinking, she turned, grabbed her coat, and walked out the door. The drive back to Rustwood felt different. The first time she had arrived, it had been by accident, a series of misfortunes that had led her to a quiet little diner and a man who had shown her unexpected kindness. This time she was making a choice. By the time she reached the outskirts of town, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the familiar streets. It was strange how quickly Rustwood had become something she associated with comfort, with clarity, with Cassian. She pulled into the small parking lot outside Rustwood Diner, her pulse unexpectedly quickening. The place was just as she had left it, modest, inviting, filled with the rich scent of coffee and fresh bread. For a moment she hesitated. She wasn't sure what she expected. When she stepped inside, Cassian was behind the counter, cleaning a glass. His movements were automatic, effortless. But the second he looked up and saw her standing there, he froze. The glass in his hand stilled. The diner, as busy as it was, suddenly felt too quiet. Lyrian took a step forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Hi," she said softly. Cassian didn't speak right away. His expression was unreadable, guarded. She swallowed hard, gripping the strap of her purse. She exhaled. "I came back." Cassian studied her, his gaze searching hers for something. "Why?" The answer was simple. Because she missed this. Because she missed him. But she knew that wasn't enough. "I left because I thought I had to," she admitted. "Because I thought this," she gestured around the diner, "wasn't my world. But I was wrong." Cassian remained silent, letting her continue. "I thought I had everything figured out," she said, her voice quieter now, "that I knew what mattered. But the second I walked back into my office, I realized I didn't belong there anymore." Cassian's jaw tightened, but something in his eyes softened. Lyrian took another step closer. "I don't know exactly what I'm doing yet. I just know that I don't want to go back to the way things were. I want to be here." Cassian let out a slow breath, his grip tightening around the towel in his hands. Thea's voice suddenly broke the silence. "See?" The little girl grinned as she ran up to Lyrian. "I told you she'd come back." Cassian finally let out a small, exasperated laugh. "Yeah, kid," he murmured, shaking his head. "I guess you did." Lyrian smiled, kneeling down to Thea's level. "You're pretty smart." Thea beamed. "I know." When Lyrian stood, her eyes met Cassian's once more. He studied her for a long moment before sighing. "You're really here to stay?" She nodded. "If you'll have me." Cassian ran a hand through his hair, then exhaled. "All right," he said at last. "Let's see what happens." And for the first time in a long while, Lyrian felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Cassian wasn't the type to be easily surprised. Running a diner in a small town meant routine, predictability. But as he and Thea strolled down Main Street one afternoon, enjoying the rare break in his usually packed schedule, he found himself stopping dead in his tracks. There, right across from Rustwood Diner, was a building that had been abandoned for years. Its windows boarded up, its paint peeling, its sign long since faded. Or at least, that was how it had been yesterday. Now, a freshly painted sign hung over the entrance, bold letters standing out against a deep blue background. "Coming soon, Haven Cafe." Cassian blinked, certain he had to be seeing things. Thea tugged at his sleeve. "Dad," she said, her voice filled with excitement. "Is that what I think it is?" Before he could respond, the door to the building swung open, and out stepped Lyrian. She looked different, not in a drastic way, but something about her had changed. There was an ease in her stance, a lightness in her expression that hadn't been there before. She no longer looked like a woman caught between two worlds. She looked like she had made a choice. And then, with a small, knowing smile, she held up a key. "Cassian," she called, walking toward him. "I need a head chef. You interested?" Cassian stared at her, then back at the sign, then at her again. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he wanted to laugh or argue. "You bought this place?" he asked, his voice caught between disbelief and amusement. Lyrian shrugged, twirling the key between her fingers. "I figured the town could use something new, and I could use something real." Cassian let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "You're serious?" She met his gaze, her smile softening. "Completely." For the past few days, he had wondered why she had come back, whether it had been a fleeting moment of doubt in her old life, or something deeper. But now, standing here, seeing this, he understood. This wasn't just about a business venture. This was her way of proving she belonged, that she wanted to stay, and damn it, if that didn't do something to his chest. Beside him, Thea was practically bouncing with excitement. "Dad, you have to say yes!" Cassian exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know, Lyrian. I'm not exactly used to working for someone else." Lyrian smirked. "Good thing you won't be. We'll be partners." Cassian raised an eyebrow. "Partners?" She nodded. "I don't want to run this place alone. And you, well, you're the best chef I know." Cassian let out another laugh, low and warm. "That's not saying much. I'm the only chef you know." Lyrian rolled her eyes. "Details?" For a moment, Cassian said nothing. He just looked at her, at the way she stood there with that mix of confidence and hope, at the way she had carved out a place for herself in a town that shouldn't have been hers. She had made a choice. Maybe it was time he made one too. Finally, he sighed, shaking his head with a chuckle. "I guess I could give it a shot." Lyrian grinned. "Good answer." Thea let out a cheer, throwing her arms up. "Best day ever." Cassian looked at Lyrian again, something unspoken passing between them. They didn't have all the answers, but maybe, just maybe, they had this. And for now, that was enough. Life doesn't always go as planned. Lyrian spent years believing success meant wealth, power, and control. But when she lost everything, her wallet, her direction, and even her certainty, she found something more valuable: purpose, connection, and a chance to start over. Her story teaches us that sometimes the setbacks we fear the most are actually the turning points we need. Like Lyrian, we often chase achievements, thinking they define our worth. But at the end of the day, success isn't just about titles or material wealth. It's about who we are, who we choose to be, and the relationships we build along the way. So how can we apply this to our own lives? Be open to change. The path you're on now might not be the right one forever. It's okay to pivot. Success is about fulfillment, not just money. Ask yourself, are you truly happy or just comfortable? Human connections matter. Never underestimate the impact of kindness, both given and received. Take risks. Starting over is scary, but regret is worse. Lyrian found happiness in a place she never expected. Maybe, just maybe, yours is waiting somewhere unexpected too. Life isn't about how much you have, it's about how much you truly live. Like Lyrian, sometimes we have to lose ourselves to find what really matters. If this story touched your heart, don't just scroll away. Be part of something real. Hit subscribe and join a community of strong, fearless women embracing second chances, new beginnings, and the beauty of life beyond expectations. Because your next chapter, it's waiting for you. And trust me, you don't want to miss it.
And helps me keep creating amazing content for you.